In a world with no global government, why isn't there constant war? No world police, no supreme authority, no enforcer of the rules. Yet we see cooperation, alliances, treaties, trade, peace that lasts decades. How? This is the foundational puzzle of the international system. And the answer is not simple, it's structural. Today, we're going to examine one of the most fundamental questions in international relations. How is order possible under anarchy? Anarchy in international relations does not mean chaos. It means the absence of a supreme central authority. There's no world government, no global police force. Each sovereign state is formally equal. Each one is on its own. This creates what we call a self-help system. The potential for conflict is ever present. So the puzzle is not why conflict happens. The puzzle is why cooperation and periods of stability happen at all. To answer this, we'll examine four different lenses, four different ways of understanding the emergence of order. By the end, you'll see how each one reveals a different mechanism of cooperation. Let's clarify the structure of the international system. Anarchy refers to the absence of hierarchy. No supreme authority exists above the nation state. China, the United States, they are all formally equal under international law. Obviously, they are not in power, but they are equal in sovereignty. And this creates a fundamental problem. In a domestic system, you have a government, a monopoly on legitimate force. If someone breaks the law, the state punishes them. But in the international system, there is no enforcer. If a state breaks a treaty, who punishes them? No one. Or more accurately, only other states can, through sanctions, isolation, or war. This is the self-help system. Each state must rely on itself for survival. In this environment, conflict should be constant. Trust should be impossible. Cooperation should be irrational. Yet somehow, we see cooperation all the time. Trade agreements, military alliances, international organizations, diplomacy. How do we explain this? That is the question. There's no single answer to the puzzle of order. Instead, we use different theoretical lenses, each bringing a different aspect of the world into focus. And each lens reveals a different primary driver of cooperation. On one end of the spectrum, you have rational calculation, cooperation driven by strategic self-interest and cost-benefit analysis. On the other end, you have social connection, cooperation driven by identity, norms, and trust. And in between, different mixtures of the two. Today, I'll introduce you to four thinkers, four scholars who each offer a different lens on this problem. Robert KEOHANE, ELINOR, HEDLEY, RATHBUN. Let's examine them one by one. Robert KEOHANE gives us the rationalist view of institutions. Institutions enable cooperation under anarchy by reducing uncertainty. ELINOR, OSTROM, shows us the power of community, self-governance. Communities can manage shared resources through local rules and monitoring. HEDLEY explains the force of the anarchical society. Even under anarchy, states form a society with norms. Brian RATHBUN reveals the psychological foundations of trust. Trust comes from moral worldviews, not only interests. Alright, let's break these down. First, Robert KEOHANE, American political scientist, one of the founders of rational institutionalism. KEOHANE asked a critical question. Can cooperation persist even after the decline of a dominant power they initially enforced it? Think about post-World War II order. The United States was a hegemon. The dominant power, it built institutions, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO. But what happens when American power declines? Do all these institutions collapse? Does cooperation fall apart? KEOHANE's answer? No. Institutions can persist because they serve a function. They reduce uncertainty. Let me show you how. KEOHANE's core argument: institutions are critical because they provide information, monitor compliance, and make commitments more credible. In a world of anarchy, the biggest problem is uncertainty. You don't know what other states are going to do. You don't know if they'll keep their promises. You don't trust them. Not because they're evil, but because you can't verify their actions. This is what we call the transaction costs of cooperation. Every time you want to cooperate with another state, you must spend time and resources figuring out what they're doing, whether they're cheating, whether you can trust them. Institutions lower these transaction costs. An institution like the World Trade Organization creates rules about trade. It monitors compliance. If a country violates the rules, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, makes the information public. Now everyone knows. Mechanism 2, monitoring. Institutions track behavior. They create transparency. This makes cheating visible and costly. Mechanism 3, credibility. The country joins an institution and it breaks its commitments. There are consequences, not just from the institution itself, but from all the other member states. Your reputation suffers. Future cooperation becomes harder. KEOHANE also introduced the concept of regimes. Set rules, norms, procedures around which actors' expectations converge in a given issue area. In the area of trade, we have a regime. Everyone understands the rules. Everyone knows what's expected. This creates predictability, and predictability makes cooperation happen. Here's what matters. States build institutions not out of goodwill. They build them because it's an efficient way to achieve their own objectives in a complex world. This is cooperation as efficient problem solving, pure rational calculation. This is the foundation of rational institutionalism. Second, ELINOR OSTROM, American political economist, Nobel Prize winner, and she studied something very specific: the governance of shared resources. Ostrom looked at fisheries, forests, water systems, what economists call the commons. These are resources no one owns individually, but everyone uses collectively. The classic prediction is that commons will be destroyed. This is called the tragedy of the commons. Everyone overuses the resource because no one has an incentive to preserve it. But Ostrom found something surprising. In many cases, communities don't destroy the commons, they manage them sustainably. for centuries even. How? Ostrom's core argument: order arises from multiple overlapping centers, decision-making, not single hierarchy. This is what she calls polycentric governance. In the traditional view, you need a central authority to manage the commons. You need the state to impose rules from the top down. Otherwise, everyone will cheat and the resource will collapse. But Ostrom showed that this is wrong. Bottom-up, community-led governance can be more effective and sustainable than top-down regulation. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine a group of farmers who share an irrigation system. They all draw water from the same canal. If there's no coordination, the farmers at the top of the canal will take too much water. The farmers at the bottom will get nothing. The system collapses. In the top-down model, the state steps in and imposes rules. You can only take this much water. The state sends inspectors to enforce it. But Ostrom found that communities often solve this problem themselves. They create local rules. They monitor each other. They impose social sanctions on anyone who cheats. Why does this work? First, the users of the resource have local knowledge. They understand the system better than the distant bureaucrat. They know when the water levels are low. They know who's cheating. Second, they have a direct stake in the outcome. If the system collapses, they suffer immediately, but they have strong incentives to make it work. Third, social sanctions are powerful. If you're a farmer and your neighbors know you're cheating, you lose your reputation. You lose their trust. You lose their cooperation in other areas. This is often more powerful than fine from the state. What Ostrom shows us is a decentralized alternative to hierarchy. Communities can self-govern shared resources through local devised rules and social monitoring. This is cooperation driven by shared resource needs and community enforcement. It blends rational calculation with social connection. Third, HEDLEY, Australian international relations theorist. And he asked a different question. Is the international system really just anarchy? Or is there something more? Bull's answer: even under anarchy, states from a society, an anarchical society, this is not a world government. This is not a hierarchy. But it is also not pure chaos. It is a society with shared norms, shared rules, shared expectations. And these norms create order. Bull's core argument: states share norms and values that create an international society, and this society shapes state behavior. Three mechanisms. Mechanism one: diplomacy. The formal and informal practice of communication and negotiation that sustain the international society. Think about diplomatic protocol. When ambassadors meet, there are rules, there are rituals, there are expectations. These aren't enforced by a world government, they're sustained by mutual recognition, by a shared understanding that diplomacy is valuable. That communication prevents war. Mechanism 2: international law. Now, international law is not perfectly enforceable. There's no world court that can force states to comply, but it still matters because it creates a framework of legitimate behavior. It creates shared expectations. When a state violates international law, other states notice. They condemn it. They isolate it. Not because a world government told them to, but because they all have a shared interest in preserving the legal order. Mechanism 3: order itself. Bull argues that the primary goal of the anarchical society is the preservation of order. States have shared interests in stability, sovereignty, and limitation of violence. Why? Because sustained war is costly, because unpredictability is dangerous, because states benefit from a world where sovereignty is respected, treaties are honored, where disputes are resolved through negotiation rather than force. What Bull shows us is that norms create order without a world government. There's a meaningful international society that exists and shapes our state behavior. This is this is cooperation driven by shared norms and values at the society level. It is more social than KEOHANE's rational institutionalism, but is still focused on states, not communities. Fourth, Ryan Rathbun, American political scientist. And he brings something interesting to the table, psychology. Most international relations theory assumes states are rational actors. They calculate costs and benefits. They pursue their interests. Rathbun says that's not the whole story. Trust is often pre-rational, comes from moral worldviews, from fundamental beliefs about human nature. This explains cooperation and conflict that rational models cannot explain. Rathbun's core argument: actors are predisposed to either trust or distrust others, based on their fundamental moral worldview. This is what he calls dispositional trust. It is not calculated, it is not based on evidence. It is a disposition, a pre-existing tendency to see the world a certain way. Some people believe in inherent human goodness. They believe people are fundamentally cooperative, fundamentally trustworthy. So when they encounter a new actor, their default is to trust. Other people believe in an inherent competition. They believe people are fundamentally self-interested, fundamentally untrustworthy. So their default is distrust. And this carries over into international relations. Leaders bring their moral worldviews into foreign policy. A leader who believes in human goodness will be more willing to make peace treaties, more willing to disarm, more willing to compromise, even when the rational calculation says, this is risky. A leader who believes in human competition will be more suspicious, more defensive, more willing to defect, even when cooperation would serve their interests. Rathbun imports concepts from social and moral psychology to explain state behavior, and this helps explain us understand phenomena that rational models cannot explain. Why are some alliances so durable, even when interests diverge? Because the leaders must trust each other. They have compatible moral worldviews. Why are some rivalries so intractable, even when cooperation would benefit both sides? Because leaders distrust each other. They have incompatible worldviews. This is the human element in international relations. Trust is not just about interest. It is about who you are, what you believe about the world. What Rathbun shows us is that cooperation is sometimes a function of innate trust, of psychological dispositions, of moral worldviews. This is the most social end of the spectrum. Cooperation as a function of identity and belief, not just calculation. Now, let's put them together. On one end, you have rational calculation, cooperation as efficient problem solving. That is KEOHANE. States build institutions because it lowers transaction costs. It's purely interest based. Then you move toward the middle. You get OSTROM. Communities self govern, share resources through local rules and monitoring. This blends rational calculation with social enforcement. There is still self-interest, but there is also community pressure, social sanctions, local norms. Then you move further and you get both. Anarchical society. States cooperate because they share norms and values. Diplomacy, international law, shared interests and order. This is more social. It's about identity as part of a society, not just isolated interests. And on the far end, you have RATHBUN. Trust based on moral cooperation as a function of innate dispositions. This is the most human, the most psychological. It's about belief, not calculation. So the spectrum runs from pure rational calculation to social connection, and each lens illuminates a different part of this spectrum. None of them is correct, none of them is wrong. They are tools, and the question is, which tool do you use to understand a particular situation? Let me show you the differences more clearly. Primary actors, KEOHANE and Bull, focus on states. OSTROM focuses on communities and individuals. RATHBUN focuses on individuals and leaders. Main driver of cooperation, KEOHANE says calculated self-interest, reduction of uncertainty. OSTROM says shared resource needs and community monitoring. Bull says shared norms and values of international society. RATHBUN says psychological dispositions and moral worldviews. KEOHANE relies on formal institutions and regimes. Sorry, the key mechanisms of each is that KEOHANE relies on formal institutions and regimes. OSTROM relies on locally devised rules and social sanctions. Bull relies on diplomacy, international law, and great power management. RATHBUN relies on intersubjective trust and identification. You can see they're operating at different levels, focusing on different actors, emphasizing different mechanisms. And the beauty of this is that they are not mutually exclusive. They are complementary. You can use all these four lenses to understand a complex world. Here's how you apply these lenses. To understand a trade agreement, use a KEOHANE lens. What are the institutions? What information do they provide? How do they monitor compliance? How do they reduce uncertainty? To analyze the management of cross-border river. Let's say a cross-border river. Apply an Austrian lens. How is the resource being governed? Are there local rules? Who monitors compliance? What are the social sanctions? To explain the persistence of the diplomatic protocol, use a Boolean lens. What are the shared norms? What role does international law play? How do great powers manage the system? Grasp the foundation of a special relationship like the US-UK alliance, each for a RATHBUN lens. What are the moral worldviews of the leaders? Do they trust each other? Is there a culture or ideological identity? True insight comes not from choosing the correct theory, but from knowing which lens to look through to make the world sharper and clearer. Different problems require different lenses, and sometimes you need to use multiple lenses at once. So let us return to the original question. In a world without a global government, how is order possible? Now you have four answers. KEOHANE. Order is possible because states build institutions that lower transaction costs and make cooperation rational. OSTROM. Order is possible because communities create local rules and monitor each other, managing shared resources sustainably. Bull. Order is possible because states form an anarchical society with shared norms, diplomacy, and international law. RATHBUN. Order is possible because actors trust each other based on moral worldviews, creating durable relationships. Each answer highlights a different mechanism. Each one is true in different contexts, and understanding all four gives you a complete picture of how cooperation emerges from anarchy. This is not about ideology. This is it's not about taking sides. This is about understanding the machinery of international order. Because when the order breaks down, when alliances collapse, when institutions fail, when trust disappears, you need to understand why. You need to see the structure. Here's the final takeaway. The international system is not simply anarchy. It is not chaos. There are multiple mechanisms, order operating simultaneously. Some are rational, institutions, regimes, cost-benefit calculations. Some are social, norm, trust, shared identity. And in the real world, they are all working at once, reinforcing each other, competing with each other, shaping the behavior of states and leaders. When you read the news, when you see a trade war, an alliance forming, a treaty being signed, a diplomatic crisis, ask yourself, which lens explains this? What mechanism of order is operating? What mechanism is failing? Because understanding international relations is not about memorizing facts, it's about seeing the systems, the structures, the mechanisms of cooperation under anarchy. See the structure behind the story. You've watched System Power. You now understand the four lenses on order from anarchy. Subscribe more for structural analysis. Like to help others see the machinery. Thank you for watching.